Hey everyone, thanks for joining me. Whether you're settling in for the night or just taking a break, I'm glad you're here. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Is it dawn or is the moon up for you like it is for me? If you enjoy these stories, please subscribe for more. Now, let's get right to it. We're about to dive into the truly dark side of Viking history. Forget everything you think you know about medieval violence. When we talk about these rulers, we're not talking about your average tyrant. These are men who were systematically cruel, combining brilliant military strategy with a truly sadistic mind. Take Eric Bloodaxe. His nickname wasn't from some epic battle. He literally murdered every single one of his brothers to seize the throne, hunting them down one by one. And the terrifying part? This was seen as a normal part of his rise to power. Most people think of Roman emperors or European tyrants when they picture evil rulers. But the Vikings created some of the most chilling leaders in history, men who saw violence not as an act of rage, but as a calculated tool. They used campaigns of terror designed to break the will of entire populations. So let's explore the brutal world of the Vikings, starting with the man who earned his crown by wading through the blood of his own family. Eric Bloodaxe is the poster child for ruthless efficiency in Viking history. As one of King Harald Fairhair's many sons, Eric knew that having too many brothers was a dangerous game. Instead of political maneuvering, he chose a more direct path, a systematic family massacre. He earned his infamous name by hunting down and murdering every single one of his siblings. These were acts of rage. The sagas describe a cold, calculated campaign. He would invite brothers to feasts under the guise of reconciliation, only to have them poisoned or stabbed by assassins. Others he would hunt down like wild animals, tracking them across Norway's fjords to isolated locations where their screams would never be heard. The most disturbing part was his patience. He would wait for years for the perfect chance to eliminate a brother. What made his actions even more terrifying was his ability to function as a respected leader while all this was happening. Publicly, he was charming and intelligent, capable of discussing poetry and politics with skill. Privately, he was orchestrating the deaths of his own family. His wife, Gunhild, was his perfect partner in crime. She was known for sorcery and political manipulation, a perfect complement to Eric's brutal methods. Together, they created a reign of terror that extended far beyond their family. While Gunhild's spies identified threats, Eric would eliminate them with ruthless efficiency. The psychological impact on Norwegian society was immense. Family loyalty, a core tenet of Viking culture, was poisoned. Parents began to see multiple sons not as blessings, but as potential sources of future bloodshed. But Eric's domestic slaughter wasn't enough. He turned his reign of terror on England and Scotland. His raids became legendary for their systematic cruelty. While most Vikings raided for wealth, Eric seemed to raid for the sheer pleasure of causing suffering. English chronicles noted that his forces were different. Where other Vikings would demand ransom, Eric's men were instructed to inflict maximum psychological damage. They would capture entire families, forcing parents to watch their children being tortured before killing them all. They burned monasteries to destroy the religious and cultural foundations of their enemies. You didn't spot Eric's fleet by his ships. You knew he was coming by the smoke from burning villages and the streams of refugees fleeing inland. His reputation was so fearsome that coastal settlements would abandon their homes entirely, just from a report that his fleet had been spotted days away. Eric understood terror as a strategic weapon. He knew that a terrifying reputation could be more powerful than an army, and he cultivated his image with the same care other leaders used for battle tactics. Every cruel act was a calculated move to break his enemy's will before he even arrived. Next, let's talk about Ivar the Boneless, a warlord whose very name was synonymous with the destruction of Christian England. As part of the legendary Great Heathen Army that invaded in 865, Ivar brought a calculated brutality to warfare that even shocked other Vikings. His nickname, the Boneless, is a mystery. Some say it was a physical condition, others that it spoke to his serpentine cunning. But what's not up for debate is the trail of destruction he left behind. Unlike other raiders who hit and ran, Ivar was a master of psychological warfare. His forces didn't just conquer, they systematically dismantled the cultural and religious backbone of Anglo-Saxon society. They didn't just loot churches, they completely destroyed them, scattering the stones and salting the foundations to prevent rebuilding. They didn't just kill priests, they tortured them in ways specifically designed to break the faith of any who witnessed it. Ivar's most infamous act of cruelty was his treatment of King Edmund of East Anglia. When Edmund refused to renounce Christianity, Ivar didn't just execute him. He subjected him to the blood eagle, a horrific Viking execution method. They would cut the victim's ribs away from their spine, pull them outward to resemble wings, then pull the lungs out and spread them across the ribs. Edmund was kept alive through the entire process, forced to suffer every agonizing moment while Ivar's men chanted pagan prayers. Ivar's genius for terror went beyond individual executions. He understood that destroying symbols was more effective than destroying armies. When his forces captured York, he had the cathedral's altar stones used as the foundations for latrines, forcing the city's population to witness the desecration of their most sacred objects every single day. Ivar's campaigns were so systematic, they revealed a mind that understood warfare on multiple levels. While his brothers focused on traditional conquest and plunder, Ivar was running a psychological operation. He studied his enemies' beliefs to find the most effective ways to break their spirits. His reputation was so fearsome that towns would surrender without a fight, just from hearing the Boneless was approaching, preferring slavery to his creative brutality. He would even keep high-ranking prisoners alive, publicly humiliating and torturing them to show their followers that their leaders were powerless. The trauma from Ivar's campaigns persisted in English memory for generations. His name became a byword for diabolic cruelty, used by parents to scare disobedient children. What's truly chilling is that Ivar seemed to genuinely enjoy this psychological aspect of conquest, spending hours planning new ways to break his enemies' spirits. His success in using terror as a weapon would inspire a new generation of Viking warlords to compete in devising ever more horrifying ways to intimidate their enemies. From the frozen lands of Norway, we come to Olaf Tryggvason, a man whose conversion to Christianity somehow made him even more terrifyingly violent. This wasn't a peaceful spiritual awakening. Olaf wielded Christianity like a blood-stained axe, using his new faith to justify a level of cruelty that would have impressed even Eric Bloodaxe. What makes Olaf's story so disturbing is that he turned religious conversion into a weapon of mass torture. When he decided Norway should become Christian, he didn't send missionaries. Instead, he traveled from village to village with a simple ultimatum: convert now, or suffer agonies that would make you beg for a swift death. And he always delivered on his threats. The sagas describe his conversion methods in gruesome detail. When he met resistance from pagan leaders, he would subject them to tortures specifically designed to break their spirits. He understood that forcing someone to renounce their ancestral gods required destroying their very sense of identity, and he approached this with the precision of a master craftsman. One of his most notorious techniques was called hot iron persuasion. Pagan priests would be stripped and bound, while red-hot iron implements were applied to their bodies. But this wasn't random rage. Olaf would start with non-lethal areas, slowly escalating the pain while repeatedly offering the option of conversion. The psychological pressure was immense. They knew converting would end their suffering, but renouncing their gods would destroy their standing in their community and their place in the afterlife. Olaf's cruelty was fueled by his belief that he was saving their souls. Unlike rulers who might show mercy when their anger cooled, Olaf's religious fervor made compromise impossible. You either converted or you suffered until you died or lost your mind, and he saw both as divinely ordained outcomes. When he arrived at a settlement, he would immediately identify the leaders and force the population to watch as they were tortured, creating a collective trauma that made resistance impossible for most people. He would even use family relationships as leverage, forcing parents to watch their children being tortured, or vice versa, while offering each person the power to end the suffering of their loved ones by converting themselves. This created impossible moral dilemmas that destroyed traditional family and community bonds. Olaf would even quote Christian scripture while torturing pagan priests, creating a horrifying contrast between divine love and immediate physical agony. He specifically targeted Norse concepts of honor and ancestral connection. Leaders who converted under torture were forced to publicly renounce not just their gods, but their ancestors and personal honor. This cultural destruction was often more devastating than the physical pain, leaving converts completely isolated. The long-term effect of Olaf's campaigns was in Norway, where Christianity was associated not with love and redemption, but with terror and submission. The techniques he pioneered for breaking cultural resistance would spread throughout Scandinavia, inspiring other kings to adopt similar methods and fundamentally changing how Norse leaders approached conquest. Next, we have Magnus the Cruel, a Danish king whose reign proves how paranoia and fear can turn a competent ruler into a monster. Magnus didn't start out as a brutal man, but his fear of potential threats transformed him. He started to see enemies everywhere and betrayal in every conversation. His intelligence, combined with his complete inability to trust anyone, made him truly dangerous. Unlike rulers who were cruel out of simple sadism, Magnus was smart enough to build sophisticated systems to find and eliminate threats. The problem was his definition of a threat expanded to include almost anyone with authority. The first signs of his descent were subtle but ominous. He began demanding elaborate loyalty oaths from his nobles. These weren't just pledges of allegiance. They included clauses about reporting suspicious conversations and surrendering family members as hostages. What began as a precaution against rebellion became a comprehensive surveillance system that turned every noble into a potential suspect and an unwilling informant. His treatment of suspected conspirators was methodical. Instead of just executing them, he would orchestrate elaborate investigations with torture designed to extract confessions and identify co-conspirators. His tortures weren't just about causing pain. They were about breaking a person's will to resist and getting information. The psychological pressure Magnus created was more devastating than his physical cruelty. Nobles lived in constant anxiety, never knowing when an innocent conversation could be seen as treasonous. This created a society where no one was safe to speak freely, build real relationships, or do anything that might be seen as suspicious. Magnus was a master of creating self-fulfilling prophecies. His brutal responses to perceived threats created real resentment, which he then saw as justification for his paranoia, creating a vicious cycle. He would even test his supporters' loyalty by spreading false information to see who would report it back. These tests became so dangerous they often required nobles to betray friends or family. His execution methods were legendary, not just for their cruelty, but because he used them as a public education tool. When he executed a traitor, he would force the entire court to watch, explaining in detail why each specific torture was being applied. The final years of his reign saw him descend into madness, suspecting his own family, servants, and bodyguards. The palace became a place of constant terror, where no one knew if their next interaction with the king would be their last. The most chilling part of Magnus's reign was how his paranoia became infectious, spreading through Danish society like a plague. The social fabric unraveled, and trust became impossible. His systematic destruction of trust shows how quickly a civilization can collapse when fear is the only governing principle. Madness's paranoid rule seems tame in comparison to our next figure, Sigurd Snake in the Eye. His nickname didn't come from a physical feature, but from his ability to strike with the sudden, venomous precision of a serpent. Sigurd's true power wasn't in battle, but in how he controlled death. He turned executions from a swift necessity into a prolonged, artistic performance that could last for days or weeks. Chroniclers described his approach to torture as almost scholarly. He would carefully study his victims, learning their fears and traumas before their torment began. This wasn't random cruelty. It was a systematic process of psychological archaeology, digging into a person's soul to destroy their spirit before their body finally gave out. His most notorious innovation was what was called the living death. Victims were kept alive, but in such constant agony that they would beg for the release of death. Sigurd knew that the threat of prolonged suffering was more effective than a quick execution. Stories of prisoners kept in this state for months spread throughout his territories, creating a psychological weapon more powerful than any army. Unlike Eric Bloodaxe, who killed out of rage, Sigurd was patient. He treated torture as a craft, spending weeks planning the perfect sequence of torments. He would even consult with experts to ensure his victims could survive the maximum amount of suffering. His treatment of captured leaders became the stuff of nightmares. Instead of a quick execution, he would keep them in public cages, forcing their subjects to watch their degradation. These were carefully orchestrated displays of powerlessness, designed to show entire populations that their leaders were helpless against him. The psychological impact extended beyond the victims. Parents would use stories of Sigurd's cages to terrify their children. Warriors would lose their courage at the mere mention of his name. The knowledge that capture by Sigurd meant something far worse than death made military resistance nearly impossible. But the most disturbing part of his methods was how he involved the victims' families and followers. Captured nobles were forced to watch their children being tortured, and their subjects were given the choice to either watch or suffer the same fate themselves. These impossible moral dilemmas destroyed the bonds of loyalty that held society together. Sigurd would even hold educational sessions during his tortures, explaining to the crowd why each punishment was being applied, a lesson in the consequences of opposing his authority. His reign created a political paralysis that lasted long after his death. His methods spread like a contagion throughout the Viking world, inspiring a new generation of leaders to compete in devising ever more horrifying ways to intimidate their enemies. Moving from one cruel mind to another, we now meet Harald Bluetooth, a warlord whose reign was so systematically brutal that medieval chroniclers struggled to describe it in human terms. Some believed he was a demonic entity in human form. What made Harald uniquely terrifying was his ability to combine the organizational skills of a brilliant administrator with the sadistic creativity of a psychopath. Unlike other rulers whose cruelty was chaotic, Harald treated brutality as a systematic business that required careful planning and continuous innovation. He even had workshops dedicated to developing new torture methods, staffed by specialists who approached their craft with the same dedication as master artisans. His treatment of conquered populations reveals the industrial scale of his cruelty. Instead of just killing or enslaving enemies, Harald implemented what he called educational programs to systematically break the cultural and psychological foundations of entire communities. These programs involved separating families, destroying religious artifacts, and forcing survivors to participate in rituals that violated their deepest beliefs. He would study the traditions of conquered people, not out of curiosity, but to find the most effective ways to destroy their sense of identity. Sacred sites were desecrated in ways designed to cause maximum psychological trauma. What distinguished Harald was his understanding that psychological manipulation could be more effective than physical destruction. He found that forcing people to betray their own values created a deeper, more lasting trauma than terrorizing them with violence. His territories became laboratories for testing methods of breaking human spirits. He even created a network of informants, forcing ordinary people to become complicit in the oppression of their neighbors. Contemporary accounts describe Harold conducting elaborate ceremonies to normalize cruelty, making participation in brutality a requirement for social acceptance. Citizens who didn't show enough enthusiasm would become targets themselves. This created a level of psychological pressure so intense that many of his subjects began to internalize his values, believing that extreme cruelty was not only necessary but morally justified. This transformation of victims into willing participants is perhaps the most chilling aspect of his legacy. His influence extended through a network of imitators who spread his methods throughout the Viking world. Harald had proven that systematic cruelty could be presented as enlightened governance, making his victims grateful for their own suffering. As we explore these stories of cruelty, we see a pattern emerge, how power corrupts and how violence becomes normalized, but our journey isn't over. Some warlords took cruelty to a level that was pure evil, systematically corrupting entire societies. This brings us to Ragnar Hairy Britches, whose name sounds comical today, but whose psychological warfare was so sophisticated it fundamentally changed Viking society's relationship with fear. Ragnar's real power wasn't his strength or tactical brilliance, but his intuitive grasp of human psychology. He weaponized shame and humiliation as tools of conquest. While other leaders used physical intimidation, Ragnar discovered that destroying a person's dignity and self-worth was far more devastating than killing them. He pioneered what sources call the ritual of degradation. When his forces captured a settlement, he wouldn't immediately kill or enslave the people. Instead, he would implement elaborate ceremonies to strip away their identity. Captured nobles would be forced to perform the most menial and degrading tasks for their former subjects to see, shattering social hierarchies and demoralizing entire communities. Ragnar would even force captured kings to serve as entertainment for his warriors, making them perform humiliating dances or recite poems about their own failures. These were carefully choreographed performances to show that traditional power and respect were meaningless against his will. His psychological warfare wasn't just for individuals, it was for entire communities. Knowing that Viking society was built on honor and lineage, he specifically targeted these cultural foundations. Families would be forced to denounce their ancestors, warriors to publicly confess cowardice, and religious leaders to mock their own gods. These forced betrayals created a trauma that lasted long after the physical threat was gone. Ragnar's distinguishing characteristic was his patience. Instead of terrorizing people into submission quickly, he would spend months slowly dismantling their psychological defenses. His treatment of captured women was particularly disturbing. He implemented what he called lessons in powerlessness, public ceremonies where women's social and cultural roles were systematically mocked and destroyed. The pressure was so intense that people began to police themselves, living in constant fear that any action or word could lead to public humiliation. The long-term effects of Ragnar's psychological warfare made resistance unthinkable. Generations grew up knowing that challenging authority risked not just death, but public degradation that would ruin their family's reputation forever. His methods spread throughout Scandinavia, inspiring other leaders to see shame as more powerful than pain. The most chilling part of his legacy is how his methods created a generation of Vikings who genuinely enjoyed inflicting psychological suffering, seeing the destruction of human dignity as an art form. From the psychological lapse of Ragnar, we come to Halfdan the Black. His nickname came not from his appearance, but from the darkness that followed him everywhere he went. Halfdan represents the purest form of nihilistic violence in Viking history. He destroyed not for power or advantage, but because destruction itself seemed to give him a twisted satisfaction nothing else could. His cruelty had no coherent motivation, which made it even more terrifying than strategic brutality. You couldn't negotiate with it or understand it. Chroniclers described Halfdan's raids as fundamentally different from others. Most Vikings raided for wealth or slaves, but Halfdan's forces were more interested in maximizing suffering. They would pass by wealthy targets to attack poor settlements where they could spend more time tormenting the people. His treatment of prisoners reveals the depth of his psychological darkness. He would keep them alive solely for his experiments in creative torture. Chroniclers describe him as having collections of prisoners who had no practical purpose other than to satisfy his appetite for pain. He would conduct investigations into the nature of suffering, subjecting prisoners to increasingly elaborate tortures while carefully observing their responses. These weren't interrogations. They were purely experimental procedures designed to find new ways to break human spirits and prolong agony. This methodical approach suggests a mind that studied cruelty with the same curiosity others might have for natural science. What set Halfdan apart was his ability to corrupt his entire army. He turned ordinary Viking warriors into enthusiastic participants in his purposeless suffering. His men would compete to devise new tortures, creating a culture of cruelty that grew more extreme with each new act. His approach to conquest was the systematic cultivation of despair. He would implement long-term campaigns designed to slowly drain all hope and meaning from a population. These campaigns could last for years, turning entire regions into psychological wastelands. In Halfdan's territories, people's emotions began to atrophy. Constant exposure to random, purposeless violence made them psychologically numb, incapable of forming genuine relationships or feeling joy. This emotional deadness was more devastating than physical destruction, as it robbed people of the inner resources to rebuild their lives. His influence was toxic because he showed that cruelty could be an end in itself. He proved that human beings could be trained to enjoy inflicting suffering on others, turning his territories into proving grounds for the limits of moral corruption. Following Halfdan's nihilism, we meet Svein Forkbeard, a Danish king who industrialized Viking brutality. Where previous tyrants saw cruelty as a personal passion or a strategic tool, Svein transformed systematic violence into a government institution. He created bureaucratic systems to organize and implement terror on a scale never seen before. What made him so dangerous was his organizational genius combined with a complete lack of moral restraint. He understood that individual acts of cruelty had a limited impact compared to systematic, consistent campaigns of terror. His reign marked the transition from personal tyranny to institutional oppression. He created what chroniclers called departments of intimidation, staffed by specialists who treated terror as a professional discipline. These weren't random thugs, but organized bureaucracies with clear hierarchies and performance metrics based on their effectiveness in breaking resistance. Svein would hold regular reviews of his terror operations, analyzing which techniques worked best and refining his methods based on empirical results. This systematic cruelty gave him a level of psychological control that individual tyrants could never achieve, as his systems could operate without his personal attention. When he conquered territories, he would implement comprehensive systems for monitoring every aspect of daily life. These systems included networks of informants and carefully calibrated punishments to maintain fear, without completely destroying economic productivity. What set Svein apart was his understanding that sustainable oppression required popular participation. He created incentive systems that rewarded citizens for reporting suspicious behavior, turning neighbors into informants and friends into potential enemies. Chroniclers describe how collaboration with oppression became the price of survival. People were forced to choose between protecting their families and maintaining their integrity, living with the psychological consequences of their choices. Svein's approach to resistance was multi-staged, designed to identify and destroy opposition movements before they could even gain momentum. He focused on preemptive terror, making organized opposition virtually impossible. The psychological impact of living under Svein's system was devastating. The constant knowledge that every conversation and relationship was being monitored created a level of chronic stress that fundamentally altered how people related to each other. His methods spread throughout the Viking world through his disciples, who exported his institutional approach to terror. Svein had proven that systematic cruelty could become a self-sustaining government structure, and his legacy showed that oppression could become a permanent feature of a political system if Svein industrialized terror. Then Harald Hardrada turned it into an art form. His name translates to hard ruler, and he redefined what it meant to be feared. Harald didn't just rule through terror. He transformed it into a sophisticated system that combined the insights of a master manipulator with the sadism of a complete monster. His reign was the absolute peak of Viking cruelty, where oppression became something almost supernatural. What made Harald terrifying was his ability to synthesize and surpass the methods of his predecessors, Eric Bloodaxe, Ivar the Boneless, and Svein Forkbeard. He had studied their techniques and combined them into something far more horrifying. His understanding of human psychology was so profound that chroniclers questioned if he had supernatural insight. He could look at a person and immediately identify their deepest fears and vulnerabilities. His approach to breaking prisoners went beyond physical torture. He would conduct what he called conversations with the soul, extended interrogations designed to systematically dismantle a person's sense of identity and purpose. He would force prisoners to confront their moral compromises and secret shamnas until they saw themselves, as he did, worthless and contemptible. This was how he created his willing slaves, prisoners so broken they believed they deserved their suffering. These living examples demonstrated the futility of resistance more powerfully than any display of force. Harald's psychological operations were on an industrial scale. When he conquered territories, he implemented programs to systematically corrupt the moral and cultural foundations of society. This involved forcing entire communities to participate in rituals that violated their deepest values, creating collective guilt and shame. He would hold festivals of degradation where parents were compelled to denounce their children, and priests were made to blaspheme against their own gods. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were carefully orchestrated events to create a collective trauma that would last for generations. He understood that true power was not in controlling actions, but in controlling thoughts and feelings. He found that people who had been forced to betray their values would internalize a sense of worthlessness that made them more controllable than any external threat. His territories were laboratories for testing psychological manipulation. He created incentive structures that made collaboration with his regime the only rational choice for survival. People weren't just afraid of Harald. They became invested in his success because opposing him meant confronting their own complicity in his crimes. His psychological contagion was so powerful it even corrupted his own followers, turning ordinary warriors into enthusiastic participants in systematic cruelty. They would compete to devise new tortures, creating a culture of sadism that fed on itself. Harald's methods of resistance were the most sophisticated ever developed. Instead of just punishing rebels, he created systems to corrupt potential opponents before they could even organize. He would target their families and communities, compromising their moral authority and social standing. His campaigns created a psychological isolation that made resistance seem pointless. The long-term effects of his reign were societies where normal human relationships became impossible. Trust, loyalty, and love were all vulnerabilities to be exploited. His methods spread throughout Scandinavia, proving that psychological warfare could be more effective than military conquest. Harald's legacy proved that under the right conditions, ordinary people could be transformed into willing participants in their own oppression, fundamentally changing Viking culture from one that valued honor to one that prioritized survival and submission. His territories became kingdoms of the walking dead, populated by people who were technically alive, but so psychologically broken that they were incapable of resistance or creative thought. Moving beyond individual tyrants to examine the systematic nature of Viking brutality, we begin to understand how these methods of terror became embedded in the very fabric of Norse society. The transition from personal cruelty to institutional oppression represents one of the most significant developments in the history of systematic evil, showing how individual psychopaths can create systems that perpetuate their cruelty long after they themselves have passed from the scene. The evolution of Viking brutality from the personal sadism of Eric Bloodaxe to the institutional terror of Harald Hardrada reveals a progression that mirrors the development of evil throughout human history. Each generation of tyrants built upon the techniques of their predecessors, refining and systematizing methods of control until they created forms of oppression that were far more effective and lasting than anything achieved through individual cruelty alone. This systematic approach to terror created changes in Viking society that persisted long after the original tyrants had died. Communities that had been subjected to these psychological warfare techniques remained damaged for generations, unable to rebuild the social trust and moral foundations that had been systematically destroyed. The cultural trauma inflicted by these rulers became embedded in the collective memory of their societies, influencing how people understood concepts like authority, resistance, and moral responsibility. The techniques pioneered by these Viking tyrants didn't remain confined to Scandinavia, but spread throughout medieval Europe and beyond, influencing how rulers throughout the known world understood the relationship between power and fear. The systematic approaches to psychological manipulation that had been developed in Viking territories became tools that would be used by oppressors and tyrants for centuries to come, creating a legacy of institutionalized cruelty that extends far beyond the original context of their creation. As we examine these patterns of systematic brutality, we begin to see how individual evil can metastasize into institutional oppression, creating systems of control that become self-perpetuating and increasingly sophisticated over time. The Viking tyrants we've examined represent not just individual monsters, but pioneers in the systematic study and application of psychological warfare. Men who transformed cruelty from a personal characteristic into a governmental institution. The psychological techniques these rulers developed for breaking human spirits and corrupting moral foundations became so effective that they continued to influence human civilization long after the Viking Age had ended. Their methods provided blueprints for systematic oppression that would be adopted and refined by tyrants throughout history, creating a dark legacy that continues to influence how power is exercised and maintained in societies around the world. But the story of Viking brutality extends beyond even these systematic approaches to terror, encompassing forms of cruelty and oppression that challenge our understanding of what human beings are capable of inflicting upon one another. The darkest chapters of this history reveal not just individual monsters or institutional systems, but something approaching pure evil in its most concentrated and refined form. The psychological landscapes created by these Viking tyrants represent some of the most thorough destructions of human dignity and moral agency ever recorded in historical sources. Their territories became laboratories for testing the limits of human endurance and the boundaries of moral corruption. Places where the fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization were systematically challenged and destroyed. Contemporary observers struggled to find adequate language to describe what they witnessed in these kingdoms of terror, suggesting that the experiences being inflicted went beyond normal categories of human suffering and entered realms that challenged basic assumptions about what was possible in human relationships. The systematic nature of the cruelty being practiced created new categories of trauma and damage that existing moral and psychological frameworks were inadequate to address. The legacy of these Viking tyrants extends far beyond their immediate historical context, providing insights into the fundamental nature of human evil and the conditions under which it can flourish and spread. As we continue our examination of these blood-soaked chapters of Viking history, we begin to understand that we're not just studying individual monsters or historical curiosities, but examining fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and the conditions under which evil can flourish and spread. The techniques these rulers developed for breaking human spirits and corrupting moral foundations represent some of the most sophisticated approaches to systematic oppression ever devised, creating legacies that continue to influence human civilization to this day. The progression from individual cruelty to systematic terror that we trace through these Viking rulers reveals patterns that extend far beyond their immediate historical context, providing insights into how evil evolves and adapts to become more effective over time. Their innovations in psychological warfare and systematic oppression created templates that would be used by tyrants throughout subsequent history, establishing precedents for institutional cruelty that continue to influence how power is exercised and maintained in societies around the world. But our journey through the darkest chapters of Viking brutality is approaching its most disturbing revelations. As we prepare to examine the ultimate expressions of systematic evil that emerge from this culture of institutionalized terror, the techniques and methods we've explored so far represent merely the foundation for even more sophisticated and devastating approaches to human oppression that would push the boundaries of what civilized people believed was possible in human relationships. The culmination of Viking brutality reached its absolute peak with Thorin's skull splitter, whose very existence seemed to challenge the fundamental assumptions about what human beings were capable of becoming. Unlike the systematic tyrants we've examined, Thorin represented something that transcended mere political oppression or strategic cruelty, embodying a form of evil so pure and concentrated that contemporary chroniclers questioned whether they were witnessing the actions of a mortal man or some demonic entity that had assumed human form to inflict maximum suffering upon the world. What distinguished Thorin from every other brutal ruler we've encountered was his complete transcendence of human motivation. Where Eric Bloodaxe killed for power, Ivar tortured for conquest, and Harold manipulated for control, Thorin seemed to operate from a realm beyond human understanding, pursuing objectives that made sense only within the twisted logic of absolute evil. His actions couldn't be explained by greed, ambition, revenge, or even sadistic pleasure, but seemed to flow from some fundamental commitment to maximizing the amount of suffering and despair present in the world. Contemporary sources describe Thorin's approach to conquest as fundamentally different from anything that had come before. His forces didn't raid for wealth, territory, or strategic advantage, but seemed to seek out opportunities to inflict the maximum possible psychological damage on their victims. They would bypass rich targets that offered substantial plunder to attack communities, where they could spend more time conducting what Thorin called experiments in the nature of despair. Elaborate tortures designed not to extract information or demonstrate power, but to explore the absolute limits of human endurance. His treatment of captured populations reveals the systematic nature of his approach to creating suffering. Rather than simply killing or enslaving defeated enemies, Thorin would implement what he termed educational programs in the reality of powerlessness. Complex psychological campaigns designed to strip away every source of meaning, hope, and identity that gave people reason to continue existing. These programs could last for months or even years, gradually escalating in their psychological sophistication until entire communities existed in states of living death, technically alive but completely broken in spirit. The sources describe how Thorin would study his victims with the same methodical attention that scholars devoted to understanding natural phenomena carefully observing their responses to different forms of psychological pressure and refining his techniques based on their effectiveness in breaking human spirits. He maintained detailed records of his experiments, creating what contemporary chroniclers describe as libraries of human suffering that cataloged the most effective methods for destroying hope, faith, love, and every other emotion that made life worth living. What made Thorne's methods particularly horrifying was their complete lack of practical purpose. Unlike other tyrants who use cruelty as a means to achieve political or military objectives, Thorne seemed to pursue suffering as an end in itself, as if the act of causing pain was the only thing that gave meaning to his existence. This purposeless evil was far more terrifying than strategic brutality because it couldn't be negotiated with, reasoned with, or even properly understood by normal human psychology. His approach to psychological warfare involved techniques so sophisticated that they challenged contemporary understanding of human nature itself. Thorne had discovered methods for making people complicit in their own destruction, creating psychological dynamics where victims would actively participate in increasing their own suffering while believing they were making rational choices for survival. These techniques created forms of trauma so profound that they fundamentally altered how people understood concepts like choice, responsibility, and moral agency. Contemporary accounts describe how Thorne's territories became places where normal categories of human experience ceased to function. Love became a source of vulnerability that could be exploited for torture. Hope became a weakness that invited greater suffering, and faith became a target for systematic destruction. People learned to suppress every positive emotion because displaying any sign of happiness or contentment would immediately draw Thorne as attention and result in elaborate punishments designed to crush whatever spark of joy had dared to manifest itself. His influence on his followers was perhaps even more disturbing than his direct victims' experiences. Thorne possessed an uncanny ability to identify individuals who possessed latent capacities for extreme cruelty and to cultivate these tendencies until they flowered into enthusiastic sadism. His armies became composed not of reluctant soldiers following orders, but of true disciples, who had been converted to his philosophy that causing suffering was the highest form of human achievement. The psychological contagion that Thorne created spread throughout his territories like a plague, infecting everyone who came into contact with his methods and philosophy. Ordinary people began to compete with each other to demonstrate their loyalty to his regime by devising new forms of cruelty to inflict on their neighbors and family members. Communities that had once been characterized by mutual support and cooperation became landscapes of suspicion, betrayal, and casual brutality where everyone lived in constant fear of being targeted by their own relatives and friends. His approach to resistance was so sophisticated that it prevented opposition from even forming in the minds of potential rebels. Rather than waiting for resistance to manifest and then crushing it, Thorne created psychological conditions that made the very concept of resistance literally unthinkable. He understood that rebellion required hope, and he systematically eliminated every possible source of hope from his territories until people became incapable of imagining that their circumstances could ever improve. The techniques Thorne developed for destroying hope were so effective that they created what contemporary observers described as kingdoms of the living dead, territories populated by people who continued to breathe and move, but had been so thoroughly broken that they existed in states of complete emotional numbness. These populations became incapable of joy, love, creativity, or any other positive emotion, creating societies that were stable but utterly devoid of anything that made human existence worthwhile. His methods for corrupting moral foundations were equally devastating. Thorne discovered that people could be made to betray their deepest values through carefully constructed moral dilemmas that made betrayal seem like the only rational choice for survival. Parents would be forced to choose between saving one child by sacrificing another. Communities would be compelled to select members for torture to spare the rest. And religious leaders would be made to choose between blasphemy and watching their congregation suffer. These forced moral compromises created psychological damage that persisted long after the immediate threats had passed. People who had been forced to make such choices would internalize feelings of guilt and self-hatred that made them more controllable than any external threat could achieve. They would come to see themselves as fundamentally corrupted and unworthy of redemption, creating a psychological prison that was far more effective than any physical confinement. The systematic nature of Thorin's approach to evil created changes in human psychology that challenged fundamental assumptions about moral agency and personal responsibility. His victims didn't just suffer physical pain or emotional trauma, but experienced what can only be described as spiritual annihilation, the complete destruction of everything that gave their existence meaning and purpose. This form of damage was so profound that it couldn't be healed through normal processes of recovery and healing, but required the complete reconstruction of basic assumptions about reality and human relationships. Contemporary chroniclers struggled to find adequate language to describe what they witnessed in Thorin's territory, suggesting that the experiences being inflicted transcended normal categories of human suffering and entered realms that challenged basic assumptions about what was possible in human relationships. The systematic nature of the cruelty being practiced created new categories of trauma and damage that existing moral and psychological frameworks were inadequate to address. His influence extended far beyond his immediate territories through networks of disciples who exported his methods to other kingdoms and cultures throughout the known world. These weren't just political allies or military commanders, but true converts to his philosophy. That systematic suffering was the highest form of human achievement. They established schools and institutions devoted to refining and perfecting his techniques, creating legacies of institutionalized cruelty that would influence human civilization for centuries to come. The psychological techniques Thorin developed were so sophisticated that they continued to evolve and spread long after his death, adapted and refined by subsequent generations of tyrants and oppressors who built upon his innovations to create even more effective methods of systematic control. His discoveries about human psychology and the conditions under which people could be made to betray their deepest values became foundational knowledge for anyone seeking to establish and maintain absolute power over human populations. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Thorin's legacy was his demonstration that evil could become self-perpetuating, creating systems and institutions that continued to generate suffering long after their original architect had passed from the scene. His territories became laboratories for testing the limits of human moral corruption, proving that under the right conditions, ordinary people could be systematically transformed into enthusiastic participants in the most extreme forms of cruelty imaginable. The progression from individual psychopaths to systematic institutional oppression that we've traced through these Viking rulers represents one of the darkest chapters in the history of human evil, revealing how individual cruelty can metastasize into cultural pathologies that persist for generations. Thorin's innovations in psychological warfare created templates for systematic oppression that would be used by tyrants throughout subsequent history, establishing precedents for institutional cruelty that continue to influence how power is exercised and maintained in societies around the world. Moving beyond individual tyrants to examine the broader cultural impact of systematic brutality, we begin to understand how these methods of terror became embedded in the very fabric of Norse society. The transformation of Viking culture from a warrior society that valued courage and honor into a landscape of systematic oppression reveals something fundamental about how evil spreads and adapts to become more effective over time. The techniques pioneered by these brutal rulers didn't remain confined to their immediate territories, but spread throughout Scandinavia and beyond, creating a contagion of systematic cruelty that influenced military and political thinking throughout medieval Europe. Rulers who had never directly encountered these methods began to adopt similar approaches to controlling their subjects. Recognizing the effectiveness of psychological warfare in maintaining power and preventing resistance, the cultural trauma inflicted by these systematic approaches to terror created changes in human psychology that persisted long after the original tyrants had died. Communities that had been subjected to these psychological warfare techniques remained damaged for generations, unable to rebuild the social trust and moral foundations that had been systematically destroyed. The collective memory of these experiences became embedded in cultural traditions and social institutions, influencing how people understood concepts like authority, loyalty, and moral responsibility. Contemporary sources describe how the spread of these techniques created what can only be termed an epidemic of systematic cruelty throughout the Viking world. Communities that had once been characterized by mutual support and cooperation became landscapes of suspicion and betrayal, where everyone lived in constant fear of being targeted by their own neighbors and family members. The psychological methods developed by individual tyrants became normalized aspects of social interaction, creating cultures where casual brutality was seen as natural and necessary for survival. The institutionalization of these approaches to psychological warfare created governmental and social structures that were specifically designed to maintain optimal levels of fear and despair throughout entire populations. These systems became so sophisticated that they could operate independently of individual leaders, creating forms of oppression that were far more stable and enduring than anything that depended on the personal characteristics of particular rulers. The long-term effects of this systematic approach to terror extended far beyond the immediate victims to influence the fundamental character of Viking civilization itself. The culture that had once produced explorers, artists, and innovators became focused primarily on the refinement and application of techniques for causing suffering. Creative energies that might otherwise have been devoted to building and creating were instead channeled into devising ever more sophisticated methods of psychological manipulation and control. The psychological landscape created by these systematic approaches to evil became so pervasive that it influenced how people throughout the Viking world understood basic concepts of human relationships and social organization. Trust, loyalty, love, and friendship all became potential sources of vulnerability that could be exploited by those in power, creating social environments where genuine human connection was too dangerous to risk. The spread of these techniques created what contemporary observers described as a fundamental transformation in the character of Norse civilization, changing it from a culture that celebrated individual achievement and heroic action into one that prioritized survival, compliance, and collective submission. The warriors who had once prided themselves on their independence and fierce loyalty to chosen leaders became servants of systems that demanded complete psychological surrender in exchange for basic survival. This cultural transformation had profound implications for how Viking society understood concepts like courage, honor, and moral responsibility. The traditional values that had defined Norse identity became liabilities in environments where displaying any sign of independence or moral conviction could result in systematic psychological torture. People learned to suppress their deepest beliefs and values, creating internal psychological landscapes that mirrored the external environments of systematic oppression they inhabited. The techniques developed by these brutal rulers for breaking human spirits and corrupting moral foundations became so refined that they influenced military and political thinking throughout the medieval world and beyond. Their innovations in psychological warfare provided blueprints for systematic oppression that would be adopted and adapted by tyrants throughout history, creating a dark legacy that continues to influence how power is exercised and maintained in societies around the world. The evolution of Viking brutality from individual sadism to systematic institutional terror represents a case study in how evil adapts and evolves to become more effective over time. Each generation of tyrants built upon the innovations of their predecessors, creating increasingly sophisticated approaches to psychological manipulation and control that pushed the boundaries of what civilized people believed was possible in human relationships. But the story of these terrible Viking kings and warlords reveals something even more disturbing about human nature itself, demonstrating the conditions under which ordinary people can be systematically transformed into willing participants in the most extreme forms of cruelty and oppression. Their methods proved that evil is not just a characteristic of individual psychopaths, but a systematic force that can be cultivated, refined, and institutionalized to achieve levels of control that physical force alone could never accomplish. The psychological techniques these rulers developed were so sophisticated that they created new categories of human experience that existing moral and philosophical frameworks were inadequate to address. Their territories became testing grounds for exploring the absolute limits of human endurance and the boundaries of moral corruption, revealing aspects of human psychology that most people prefer not to acknowledge or understand. As we examine the broader implications of their legacy, we begin to see how the techniques they pioneered for systematic oppression continued to influence human civilization centuries after the Viking Age ended. Their innovations in psychological warfare provided foundational knowledge for anyone seeking to establish and maintain absolute power over human populations, creating templates for institutional cruelty that have been adapted and refined by tyrants throughout history. The cultural damage inflicted by these systematic approaches to terror created psychological scars that persisted for generations, influencing how entire societies understood concepts like authority, resistance, and moral agency. Communities that had been subjected to these forms of psychological warfare remained traumatized long after the immediate threats had passed, unable to rebuild the social trust and moral foundations that had been systematically destroyed. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of their legacy is how it demonstrates the fragility of human civilization itself, showing how quickly societies can collapse when fear becomes the primary organizing principle of social life. The techniques these rulers developed for breaking human spirits and corrupting moral foundations revealed that the psychological foundations of civilized behavior are far more vulnerable than most people realize, capable of being systematically undermined and destroyed through sustained campaigns of psychological warfare. The progression from individual brutality to institutional terror that we've traced through these Viking rulers provides insights into fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and the conditions under which evil can flourish and spread. Their methods created precedents for systematic oppression that continue to influence how power is exercised and maintained in societies around the world, establishing patterns of institutional cruelty that persist long after their original contexts have disappeared. As we prepare to conclude our examination of these blood-soaked chapters of Viking history, we must confront the disturbing reality that their innovations in systematic cruelty represent not just historical curiosities, but ongoing challenges to human civilization itself. The psychological warfare techniques they developed continue to pose threats to the psychological and cultural foundations of free societies, requiring constant vigilance and active resistance to prevent their resurgence in new and potentially more sophisticated forms, the systematic approaches to human oppression. They pioneered established dark sciences that have been studied and refined by subsequent generations of tyrants, creating an ongoing legacy of institutional cruelty that continues to influence how power is exercised and maintained in societies around the world. Their methods provided foundational knowledge for understanding how to establish and maintain absolute control over human populations, creating templates for totalitarian governance that remain dangerously relevant to contemporary struggles for human freedom and dignity. The most sobering lesson from their reign of terror is how quickly civilization can collapse when fear becomes the primary organizing principle of social life, and how systematically applied cruelty can transform ordinary people into willing participants in the most extreme forms of oppression imaginable. Their legacy stands as a warning about the depths to which human societies can sink when the psychological foundations of moral reasoning are systematically corrupted, and the ongoing effort required to protect the cultural and institutional bulwarks that preserve human dignity against the eternal threat of systematic evil. These Viking tyrants ultimately proved that the capacity for creating comprehensive systems of human oppression exists as a permanent feature of human knowledge, waiting to be rediscovered and refined by individuals with sufficient ruthlessness and systematic thinking. Their innovations in psychological warfare created precedents that continue to influence the development of oppressive systems throughout the modern world, ensuring that their dark legacy remains a constant threat to human freedom that requires perpetual vigilance to contain and resist. The enduring horror of these Viking tyrants extends beyond their immediate historical impact to reveal something profoundly disturbing about the human condition itself. Their systematic approaches to breaking human spirits demonstrated that the psychological foundations of civilization are far more fragile than most people dare to acknowledge. The techniques they developed for corrupting moral reasoning and destroying social bonds proved that entire societies could be transformed into willing participants in systematic oppression within remarkably short periods of time. What makes their legacy particularly chilling is how their methods anticipated and provided blueprints for the totalitarian movements that would emerge centuries later. The administrative systems they created for managing comprehensive psychological control became templates that would be studied and refined by modern dictatorships, proving that the fundamental insights they gained about human nature remained dangerously relevant to contemporary political developments. The psychological warfare techniques pioneered by these rulers created what can only be described as a permanent addition to humanity's knowledge of systematic oppression. Once discovered, these methods could never be unknown or forgotten, creating an ongoing threat that would require constant vigilance from free societies to prevent their implementation. The dark sciences they developed became part of humanity's collective inheritance, waiting to be rediscovered and adapted by future generations of tyrants and oppressors. Their territories became laboratories that proved human beings could be systematically transformed into creatures barely recognizable as the same species that had created art, literature, and philosophy. The comprehensive nature of their psychological control systems demonstrated that the capacity for moral reasoning, creative thinking, and emotional connection could all be systematically eliminated through sustained applications of appropriate techniques, leaving populations that were technically human but functionally reduced to mechanical extensions of their oppressors' will. The most terrifying aspect of their achievements was how they proved that such transformations could become self-perpetuating, creating systems that continued to operate and spread long after their original architects had disappeared. The psychological damage they inflicted became embedded in cultural traditions and social institutions, ensuring that their methods would continue to influence human behavior across multiple generations, even in the absence of direct enforcement. Contemporary examination of their legacy reveals that the fundamental insights they gained about human psychology and social control have never been successfully countered or neutralized. The techniques they developed for systematic human oppression remain as effective today as they were during the Viking Age, requiring only adaptation to modern conditions and technologies to achieve devastating results in contemporary contexts. The progression from individual cruelty to comprehensive systematic terror that characterized their reigns established patterns that would be repeated throughout subsequent history, showing how evil evolves and adapts to become more efficient over time. Their innovations in psychological warfare created precedents that would be invoked by totalitarian movements throughout the modern era, demonstrating the enduring relevance of their discoveries to ongoing struggles between freedom and oppression. The cultural trauma they created through systematic psychological manipulation established hereditary patterns of damage that continue to influence human society centuries after their original context has disappeared. Communities that were subjected to their comprehensive control systems developed psychological characteristics that made them particularly vulnerable to subsequent forms of authoritarian governance, creating cycles of oppression that proved remarkably difficult to break, even when external conditions might have permitted recovery. Their ultimate legacy lies not in the specific atrocities they committed, but in their demonstration that human civilization itself contains the seeds of its own systematic destruction. The techniques they pioneered for comprehensive psychological control revealed that the social bonds, cultural institutions, and moral frameworks that protect human dignity could all be systematically undermined and corrupted through sustained campaigns of psychological warfare, creating forms of damage that would persist long after the immediate sources of oppression had been eliminated. As we reflect on the full scope of their impact on human history, we must confront the sobering reality that their innovations in systematic cruelty represent permanent additions to humanity's capacity for evil. The psychological warfare techniques they developed created dark sciences that would be studied and refined by subsequent generations of oppressors, ensuring that their methods would continue to pose threats to human freedom and dignity throughout the centuries that followed. The systematic approaches to human oppression they pioneered established templates for totalitarian control that remained dangerously relevant to contemporary political developments, requiring constant vigilance from free societies to prevent their implementation in new and potentially more sophisticated forms. Their legacy serves as a permanent reminder that the capacity for systematic evil exists as a latent potential within human civilization, waiting to be activated under appropriate conditions to create forms of suffering that transcend anything achievable through individual cruelty alone. The most sobering lesson from their reign of terror is how quickly the psychological foundations of civilized behavior can be systematically destroyed when comprehensive campaigns of psychological warfare are applied with sufficient persistence and technical sophistication. Their achievements in breaking human spirits and corrupting moral reasoning demonstrated that the characteristics we consider fundamentally human could all be systematically eliminated, leaving populations that retain their physical capabilities while becoming psychologically indistinguishable from the broken armies they had created for military purposes. These terrible Viking kings and warlords ultimately proved that the darkness within human nature could be systematically cultivated and institutionalized to create forms of evil that would persist across generations and geographical boundaries. Their innovations in psychological warfare established precedents that would influence the development of oppressive systems throughout subsequent history, creating a dark inheritance that continues to threaten human freedom and dignity to this day. Their legacy stands as an eternal warning about the vigilance required to protect the psychological and cultural foundations of civilized life against the ongoing threat of systematic evil that remains forever embedded within the human capacity for organized cruelty and comprehensive oppression. Finally, we reach the peak of Viking brutality with Thorin's Skullsplitter, a figure so evil that chroniclers questioned if he was even human. Thorin transcended political cruelty. He embodied a form of pure evil, While Eric killed for power, Ivor tortured for conquest, and Harold manipulated for control, Thorin's cruelty had no human motivation. He seemed to operate from a realm beyond understanding, pursuing only the goal of maximizing human suffering. His campaigns weren't for wealth or territory. They were experiments in the nature of despair, elaborate tortures designed to explore the absolute limits of human endurance. He would bypass rich targets to attack communities where he could spend more time tormenting the inhabitants. His treatment of captured populations involved educational programs in the reality of powerlessness, complex psychological campaigns to strip away every source of meaning and hope. These programs could last for months or years, creating communities of living dead. Thorin would study his victims with the same methodical attention as a scholar, carefully observing their responses to different psychological pressures and refining his techniques. He kept detailed records, creating libraries of human suffering. What was truly horrifying about Thorin was the purposelessness of his evil. His cruelty wasn't a means to an end. It was the end itself. This made him far more terrifying than other brutal rulers because he couldn't be negotiated with. He discovered methods for making people complicit in their own destruction, creating psychological dynamics where victims would participate in their own suffering, believing they were making rational choices for survival. He systematically eliminated all hope, creating conditions where the very concept of resistance was unthinkable. His methods for corrupting moral foundations were equally devastating. He would force people into moral dilemmas, compelling them to betray their deepest values for survival, like forcing a parent to choose which child to save. This created a psychological damage so profound it was a form of spiritual annihilation. The damage was so complete that his territories became kingdoms of the walking dead, populated by people who were technically alive but completely broken. The techniques Thorin developed for breaking human spirits spread through networks of disciples, creating schools and institutions dedicated to refining his methods. His legacy demonstrates that evil can become self-perpetuating, creating systems that continue to generate suffering long after their architect is gone. His methods anticipated and provided blueprints for the totalitarian movements that would emerge centuries later. Thorin's Skull Splitter proved that human civilization itself contains the seeds of its own destruction, a chilling reminder of how quickly the psychological foundations of civilized behavior can be destroyed when systematic. Campaigns of psychological warfare are applied with sufficient persistence and technical sophistication.